and welcome to the Rollwise Podcast, the show where good friends talk about tabletop RPGs. Today, we're going to be talking about a recent experience we had with a game called Shadowrun Anarchy. For those not familiar, Shadowrun Anarchy is kind of a rules light approach to playing Shadowrun, all the setting, all that kind of stuff, but a really stripped down version of how the rules play out. Perfect for beginners, except for the fact that it is a heavily narrative focused edition of the game. So, what people tend to say is it's very much focused on creating a great story rather than necessarily creating a good Shadowrun experience. You know, like heavy puzzles and stuff like that don't tend to be necessarily the focus as much as like the Shadowrun game, I guess. Brett, you look like you had a comment to make.
Well,
What is your comment?
it's not as tactical. Like Shadowrun
Hmm.
has a lot of like Shadowrun in its regular editions have a lot of tactical stuff. So I guess that's true. But I feel like
Hmm.
I feel like from our experience, and this is early, but I feel like from our experience, it tells a better Shadowrun story than the overly complicated recent
Yeah,
editions. But
and not to say you can't tell cool Shadowrun stories, especially since we had a fun time playing a Shadowrun adventure with it. That was really honestly a blast. But to say that we played the full Shadowrun Anarchy, I think we wouldn't be able to make that claim yet because we didn't play with the full narrative control shared by players, kind of co-GMing the entire thing. We played with the alternative rule set where the GM had a little bit more control and a little bit more guidance, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. So where do you guys want to start with this? Shadowrun definitely had skill checks and everything like that, but what kind of cool things should we highlight for this alternate to Shadowrun Fifth Edition? Because that's when the rule actually came out back
I
in
mean,
2018.
it's just more narrative. Like you get all that Shadowrun feels, which I think is important, and
Hmm.
without all of the super crunch that is Shadowrun, well, sixth edition now and fifth edition at the time.
Yeah.
Plus I feel like its rules are a little bit easier, and there's not as many glaring weird things that get left out that don't make sense
Yeah.
in the
So
complicated sixth edition rules.
So I guess at least maybe let's go with a little bit of a high level thing that talks about, like how the game kind of differs from Shadowrun because it is Shadowrun light in many ways. And so it's pretty much dice pool, which is skill attribute plus modifier. And then, of course, as opposed to Shadowrun itself, everything's a lot more consolidated and everything like that. However, your successes are determined either by an opposed dice roll, and that's kind of what determines your difficulty, or there's just a set difficulty. So there's not a lot of wide swinging variance and stuff like that. Um, Depending on how you play, initiative is kind of just it's everyone takes turns, so it's not really like the initiative system, which I believe people could very masterfully they could get really good at initiative and have lots of turns if they were a
Yeah,
speed
they could
build or
just be
something
really
like
they could
that.
be very fast, and you could get more turns. You can
Hmm.
outturn people.
That doesn't seem to be as big of a thing in this one so much. And then, of course, I think some of the newest things that they kind of introduced in this is that they have amps. Amps was kind of a cool way to manage all of the advantages your character could have. It's like your ability to cast spells, summon things, use cyberware, and all that stuff was all considered as part of these amps, which I think, from my perspective, made it a little bit easier from like the bookkeeping side of things because you didn't have to like, oh, this. You still had essence and everything like that you had to worry
Well,
about.
it defines your character more. Like amps
Hmm.
become who your character is versus like you could technically in regular Shadowrun have a character who casts spells, has cyberware,
Hmm.
does decking and stuff like that. Whereas this is more focused on your character is kind of your character, and these
Hmm.
amps, whether it's cyberware or
Hmm.
certain skills or whatever, are really more of your character focus,
Yeah.
which I think was interesting because that makes your Shadowrunner, like I said, more like I mean the goal in like sixth edition Shadowrun is to like just be good at everything. And like
Hmm.
this makes it more focused. Your character is more of a focused character, I feel like, in Shadowrun Anarchy from the little that we played.
Yep. And the nice thing is your amps are fairly limited. So like whatever your amps are, like that's a pretty narrow thing there. Don't expect to get everything everywhere all at once. Um, And I think the only other thing that really is kind of the big difference that people would probably notice from fifth edition is that there's something called the queue system. Now, I don't know this. I don't know if you guys knew this, but the queue system is actually something from a different game. Did you guys know that?
No, I wasn't
I
aware.
I think I've heard of it in reference to a different game, and I think I knew that they borrowed it from another game. Like Shadowrun
Hmm.
Anarchy is heavily borrowed from another game, I believe. Like its narrative setup is kind of borrowed from another game, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
that they kind of co-opted or co-produced Shadowrun
Or
Anarchy.
inspired how the play style of Shadowrun Anarchy
Right.
was. Because at least from what I could find, there were some people that were discussing this, and they said that like Cosmic Patrol, as well as Valiant, a superheroes game, were
Right.
both that used the queue system originally and kind of had this narrative focus. And what makes Shadowrun Anarchy so interesting and so much is that why is it anarchy? Is that literally it's very much like your team becomes kind of an improv troupe, and each person kind of co-GMs the situation. So when it's your turn, you're creating the narrative, and that's what they kind of call it. Is you're like constructing the narrative as to what's telling a really good story. And what's interesting is that like as you guys are creating the narrative, you're actually like talking about like what the NPCs are doing. You're creating the thing whole cloth to a degree, and then the GM is just kind of sitting back and letting that player go. Unless of course there's a chance of failure, then the GM steps in and all that kind of stuff. And then there are things called plot points, which can be used to make the story more interesting. They basically create significant variation in the scene. So the players spend plot points to kind of like exit a fight or change it
Right.
so that it gives them an advantage or
The
something
plot
like
points
that.
are there to guarantee your narrative choice is
Hmm.
what it's your meta currency for saying, well, I want to get away from this situation, so I'm going to spend a plot point. And then
Yeah,
the GM kind of doesn't can't he can narrate stuff around it, but he can't
mhm.
necessarily take that away from you.
Correct. Well, and the interesting thing is GM also has plot points, but they're not
Right.
really supposed to spend them to help or hinder the players. They're supposed to spend them in a kind of separate, kind of narrow channel to kind of create variation in the scene and everything like that.
Right, which you would do a
Now,
lot more if you were doing that more freeform part where you didn't
mhm,
have any narrative control. You would be more like, I'm going to spend my currency to make this change.
mhm,
You wouldn't want to do that in a situation where you're more being playing the regular GM role. It would be very hard to
mhm.
it would be very hard to not do that and seem feels badsies potentially.
Well, and so actually, when you do the more traditional style where the GM has assumed a lot more control of the narrative, you actually get fewer plot points, and
Right.
they're used in a much more limiting capacity than the actual Anarchy game and everything like that. So I think that kind of opening up the table from there. I mean, what do you guys think? So like, this was kind of our first time playing Shadowrun in a long time, at least for me. Um,
Yeah.
but like, did open up the floor. How did you guys like it?
I love Shadowrun so less, but I don't necessarily like the sixth edition rules.
Hmm.
So I feel like Shadowrun Anarchy is a good alternative to that. And I
Hmm.
feel like you could splice, if you wanted a bit more crunch, I feel like you could probably splice some regular Shadowrun rules in there fairly easily.
Yeah.
I think for the type of Shadowrun game that I like to play, this is probably the answer.
Yeah.
Versus the more crunchy, sometimes nonsensical rules that they have a tendency to put in their core rulebook.
Sure. Do you feel like you like because we played with a little bit heavier GM control and everything like that? Do you feel like you'd want to give it the full, you
No,
know, narrative declaration and
no,
everything like that, where the players, make so much more
no.
influence
It
and all
would it
that,
would be
or
more it would be more sandboxy, but I would prefer being a standard GM. I think.
okay, kind of
I
playing a
mean,
Shadowrun light then.
yeah, it would be more. Well, I mean, usually in my Shadowrun games, they have like players are encouraged to have a lot of narrative choice, anyways, because they're the life
Hmm.
games where you're kind of just living your like Shadowrunning isn't all your character does, because I
Hmm.
think that's boring. It turns into SWAT the game in regular Shadowrun, and like I don't like just going on Shadowruns isn't really what I think is interesting. I think it's interaction with the world is what's interesting.
Hmm.
So I try to encourage players to do like what do you do for your day? What does your day look like? Which
Hmm.
gives them more narrative control over their character, anyways. And they
Hmm.
kind of set up situations where, oh, my character does this and he interacts with this person. you know, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think it fits. I think it fits perfectly for my idea of what Shadowrun should be.
Sure. And Jeff, as a new player, I mean, some of the people that say that strengths of this are like the accessibility, and kind of the speed of play and stuff like that. How did you feel as your first time? Because how
I
much Shadowrun did you play prior to this
uh,
Anarchy?
I had played some, probably mostly third edition, maybe second. I haven't played for quite some time. I thought it took me personally a little bit of time to kind of get up to speed with the system to try to exert some of that narrative control and to make
Hmm.
some decisions. But once I did, I actually really liked the freedom because we kind of had the gist of where things were going, and it's not like anybody
Hmm.
took us off, like did that left turn at Albuquerque, and went totally absurdist with the whole choice.
Hmm.
Um, I kind of liked it. I kind of liked the freedom to put that in and exercise my strengths. I honestly felt like I was playing more of the character I wanted to play
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
with the Shadowrun background, as opposed to so many times I felt like, in the older versions of Shadowrun that, like I was just a decker, or, that's
Hmm.
that's what I was, and like that was my personality and that's what I did, and maybe that was just the games that I was playing in or the scenarios that
Hmm.
were being run. Um, so I kind of liked Anarchy, and how it was. I would be interested in trying the more freeformy player control of the story, but
Hmm.
you've got to have everybody's got to be bought in
Yeah.
and kind of
Yeah.
agree on, I don't know, the main points, so that you're not
Yeah.
just some sort of like Picasso painting, we're
Well,
over here.
I think one of the things is with a if you come from a background to D&D and regular Shadowrun, I think it does take time, just like we've talked about before in other games. It takes time to get that narrative control because you don't want to feel like you're hogging the spotlight, which sometimes making narrative declarations feels like, and two,
hmm.
it feels very meta sometimes when you're making those decisions,
Sometimes.
and you're really like in other games like D&D, you're encouraged not to do that.
Hmm.
Like you're not really encouraged to take narrative control. So it does take some like legwork to get used to that
Sure.
sort of environment, I think.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention about the cues is that like instead of really detailed backstories, your characters actually come with cues, which you're supposed to use if you're kind of like stuck and you just don't know what to do. You're basically supposed to look at your cue and say, well, what would my character do in this scenario? And that's kind of a nice like it's that improv prompting.
Yeah,
It's like, okay, well, I don't know what to do, so what would my character? Okay, maybe I can use this to build
exactly.
off what's come before, kind of thing.
Yeah, I used a couple of mine.
Hmm.
Not I didn't explicitly explain it out loud, but I did try
Hmm.
to utilize the cues to, decide how the character would act.
Well,
Yeah.
we played pre-gens, but the
Hmm.
Yeah,
pre-gens felt very fleshed out. Like you pretty much
Yeah.
knew who the character was. And I think if you designed a character with those like in mind, like those quotes and those
Hmm.
well, they weren't drives, what were they called?
Qualities. But
Qualities, like those
or are
qualities
you
of like
talking about because there's dispositions, cues, and qualities?
the like
Because
what
the
was
dispositions was like, well, here, let me just give some examples of each one. So the cues were like, so there was a character named Hardpoint. His cues was like fasters. Engines can only do so much, and basically Hardpoint was what was Hardpoint again? I'm
he's a
looking at him right
rigger.
now. Yeah, it looks like a rigger. Yep, has engineering, vehicle weapons, and stuff like that. Q also is something like, if you hurt my team, oh, the whole world's my zero zone. No
Yeah,
prisoners.
those were very good. Like those
Hmm.
gave you a really good idea of who your character was. And I think
Hmm.
if you made a character in this system and said, "Okay, write down six of those things that define your character," I think you would have a really good idea of who your character was
Hmm.
going into the game. More than the quotes, because I know there was quotes of things that they suggested you could say.
Oh, that those were the cues. There was the dispositions, which were kind of like
It's the
precision is
disposition.
everything.
It's the dispositions that I'm talking about then. Like I
Okay,
was less interested in the quotes, but the dispositions gave you a really good idea of who your character was because
sure.
they were like bits of personal philosophy for the character.
Hmm. Yeah, like Mitsuhama puts out the best products, or
Right.
you've got a drone for that. Just certain mindsets that your characters can get
Right. So
into and
like that
stuff.
character, that's most of the gear that they're gonna have. Like that's a
Hmm.
character defining trait of he's gonna have like most of his drones and his car or whatever gear he's gonna have is gonna be
Hmm.
that company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's nice because you can kind of cherry pick from these things as to how you build your declarations in the
Sure.
scene. If you were to do that, we didn't really do that because what we had done is we actually had taken a second edition adventure and I had converted it over to Shadowrun Anarchy, and I have to say that the way that it played out was kind of hilariously different than the game had probably expected. One of the players we had, and I thought this was kind of fit the idea of how the game should be played, is that they were like, well, my character, bigger is better. I have a contact. I went to my contact, and he role played out some really great interactions with how he played it out with the contact. And as the game master, I felt like, well, I mean, you're doing exactly what your character would do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
he rolled his dice to succeed, and everything like that. So yes, he did put an anti personnel cannon on the back of a pet washing van, I
Well,
believe it was.
first off, he talked his friend into loaning him the van, his
Yeah.
contact into loaning him
Yeah.
the van,
And
and
then he'd bring
then
it
he
back
talked,
without, yeah, and then he super modified it.
and then he talked another contact into giving him an assault cannon.
That
Borrow it.
only mounted backwards and didn't rotate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I basically had to
Well,
point the
I
van
mean,
at something.
rotating towards the front of the van is a bad idea, anyways. So we should probably
Sure.
be thankful for that.
Yeah, it probably would have ended worse.
But it's something that mechanically would be really hard to like bookkeep that type of thing, in I think regular Shadowrun. But in Anarchy, it just, hey, yeah, what the hey, let's see what happens. And then of course, they fired a warning shot across the bow at some gang that was creeping up on them in the Barrens, and I was like, well, a gang wouldn't be stupid and like go, okay, the back
Yeah.
of this van just opened up and a tank cannon popped out. Let's go get them.
If only I knew how they found us in the first place.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Well, one of
what
the
Jeff is
things,
saying is he doesn't understand that he was issuing a challenge with his motorbike.
right. In regular Shadowrun, like there's a lot more complications for getting any sort of weapon. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of senseless mechanics in my opinion in Shadowrun, like the sock game, because like in the case of getting something like that, like there's availability that you have to calculate, there's legality that you have to calculate, and there's like a subsystem for how you would go out and get one of these weapons, and I just don't necessarily know it's always necessary.
Yeah, well,
Sure.
and it made for a better story to have one of those
Mm-hmm.
installed on the back of the van, which was for washing
Yeah,
pets.
yeah. Surprisingly, it did. I didn't see quite where he was going, but man, it really wound up being one of the better things that happened in the like. Even though it was only used a little bit,
Yeah.
you know what I
Mhm.
mean. It was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was a fun
and
game. It was very fun.
and I think that's the kind of the stuff that I think when you look at it, you can go, well, because we played with a little bit more rules and we played it more as Shadowrun Light than the full Anarchy. I can see where the full Anarchy would just be insanely crazy, because then I could see like people changing the narrative to create the story and adding plot points and doing this wild and zany stuff. But you can end up with some really crazy, what are they called when you go to a face? Some cases, or what the hell were they called? Um, oh, when you go get your yeah, whatever, it's got a word. When you go get your job, like you basically select a job, you talk about the details of the job, your pay, and then in the regular Anarchy, then you just kind of go from there and go crazy. Then you
Right.
have to complete your shadow run,
Right.
whatever it's called.
No,
Well, I mean, a
The name of
Shadowrun
the
is what they're
game.
called. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Shadowrun is what they're called. Yeah.
Obviously my brain was just tickling at the word. It was like, what could that possibly be? The type of job that they do? Fucking do a shadow run, Mike. It's the name of the game.
Because it was so obvious, I wasn't sure that was the word you were looking for. So,
if only we were actually running with the shadows.
yeah. Yeah, no, I think it was. I don't know. I like I like the more narrative version, and I feel like I said, I feel like stripping out a lot of the rules is good for Shadowrun. Really, I think it's overly complicated most of the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes I want some of the crunch. Like I don't know, maybe I'm weird that I want to hack a corporate computer system, but I've never found that that was super fun for everybody else at the table.
No, no. Well, the problem, one of the problems with Shadowrun, the base game, so even sixth edition, is there's subsystems for everything,
Right.
which
Hmm.
separates everybody. Um, like they've really tried to make it so deckers have to go with the party now, which has helped a lot. But yeah, like everybody gets separate. Like if your mage is astral, he's using different rules, and then if the decker's
Hmm.
decking, he's using different rules. The rigger's doing drone stuff, like the drone rules are different. So like
Yeah.
everybody's, you have to
Sure.
know like 5 different rule sets to play the core Shadowrun game.
Hmm.
And that's what makes it really overly complicated. And then there's
Yeah.
the subsystems of like the barter, like the concealment, the availability, like the economic
Right.
the economic rule set that you have to figure out too.
No, yeah, no, sometimes it felt like I want to acquire this and it feels like something I should be able to acquire, and then
Yeah.
we rolled on like 12 separate tables.
Yeah, exactly.
Each one
What?
further decreasing the percentage chance that this was actually going to happen, and it was like you could have just said no.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so in Shadowrun Anarchy, they did so there. So this is where I think, because we didn't play a terribly long campaign to get through
Right.
all of the different types of the aspects that you would play with in fifth edition versus Anarchy and everything like that. From the amps and everything like that, they did separate out like hacking and cyber combat into their own little section, which seems kind of like, well, if you're simplifying and streamlining it, why would you give
So what
give
is cyber?
them
What do you mean cyber combat?
kind of like when you're going against like you access the matrix and either
Oh, you just mean
ARVR.
decking. You just mean
Yeah, and
decking,
all
and
combat takes place in there. That's when you start getting the
yeah, that's the same as
mhm.
most Shadowrun games. Like your decking
Yeah.
is going to always be separate. That's why I usually say there's no deckers in the party. You have a
Fair enough.
contact for that.
But honestly, I think that, I've never actually read people that have been like, oh, the Shadowrun hacking rules for any, I don't know if any edition people have been like, oh, these are the best
No,
rule subsets ever.
no, they're a
Yay.
pain in the no, they're a pain in the ass.
Hmm.
Literally, there's a system for how skills and combat works, and they made a decision to make a separate system for how all that stuff works when you're decking, and that doesn't like who somebody just wanted to make rules. It feels like sometimes it's like I had rules for this other game, and I'm gonna just put them in a Shadowrun.
You know, Brent,
Yeah.
last night I had a dream, and it was about another chart that I want to add to the to the rules.
Well, but
Well,
there, I mean,
it isn't even charts in Shadowrun. Like it's not like Hackmaster where it's like, oh, roll
Right.
37 charts to see how this
mhm,
comes out. It's more just like, oh, because you're decking, it's not strength, it's intelligence, and because you're
mhm.
decking, you have to use this program instead of this, and it's just like,
Yeah.
and then your deck matters, and then like your
I
deck
don't
adds
think they got
modifiers.
that detailed into it because none of the party member were hacked. Like none of the party members were like, "Oh, a decker, let me play that character." Because I think people have probably been traumatized by how decking had worked in the past.
Mhm.
Because there's deckers and then there's riggers. They're the ones that use the drones and
Yep,
everything, right?
Yeah, the tools,
So I,
robots, and shit. Right.
who are also
yeah,
difficult. Yeah,
yeah. Who can?
they're the like tinkerer,
Mhm.
like mechanic
Yeah.
Yeah.
drone
So
types.
I think in a longer game, it would be nice to see how they actually played in kind of our mid ground, not full anarchy, but kind of rules light Shadowrun and everything. I think that would be interesting to see, how those more specialized groups with kind of the pets, the spirits, the all that kind of stuff played out. We had some pretty fairly straightforward characters for our first foray into Shadowrun Anarchy, which I mean, when you end a gaming session and you're just like, that was fun,
Yeah, it was fun.
I think the game did its job. Now, you know, playing 10 months of this might be
I
it
think
might be
I
fun
think
for shorter adventures and
no,
small
I think the
campaigns.
narrative. I think a narrative, like a full-on narrative game of
Hmm.
Shadowrun, if you didn't just focus on Shadowruns, would be fun.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. I think it could be cool because the players would find the beats that how they want to tell the story, and they want
Hmm.
the different Shadowruns to play out, and I think you would get better at using a plot point to start. Okay, well, this is going on. This is what my character's doing, and explain
Mhm.
how they're doing and how that's furthering the story and not just
Yeah.
enhancing their glory kind of thing. Not
And
that there's anything wrong with that, but
yeah, and this makes in regular Shadowrun, a lot of times it feels like the game is nothing but just going on these tactical missions. And I think this encourages the type of gameplay that I think is more interesting Shadowrun, which is interacting with the sixth
Mhm.
world, which is interacting with magic and
Mhm.
building NPCs and kind
hmm
of that type of stuff, which I think is what's really like. There's a Shadowrun Anarchy podcast where I think the players just they're just in a stuffer shack and they're just clerks at the stuffer shack, and it's just like them dealing with things when they come in. It's kind of like uh clerks
Shadowrun Anarchy.
except Shadowrun
sure.
Anarchy.
Oh, that's neat.
And it was just kind of a fun, neat listen for the podcast, and it allowed a lot of character development.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, because a lot of times the character development comes in the banter that you have when it's not like, the person is shooting a gun or something like that. It's the
what?
in between.
Yeah, and regular Shadowrun focuses a lot on your character being a Shadowrunner. Like it's a lot of my character needs to get better at like what is the old cliche? Firearms, unarmed combat, and stealth. Those are the three things that every Shadowrun character needs to have.
Hmm.
And it's not, and this encourages that to not necessarily be what happens all the time, I think, and that's
Yeah.
cool. Like this would have been
Yeah.
perfect for our game with Hookahville,
Oh
like
yeah.
originally, like it would have been perfect for that game.
Hmm. But we were playing six at that point to try it out,
Yes,
weren't
and it
we?
was yes, and it was terrible. And I just wound up throwing a lot of the rules away, anyways.
That's fair. I may not have known the rules that you threw away. That might have been it. That might be more me than you. So,
It's like sure
so,
that happens.
so, so I think that's. I mean, so Shadowrun Anarchy is honestly, I think the kind of game I feel like in my old age, I'm more enjoying just like kind of the free form, like letting players kind of make decisions and stuff like that. Less the crunchy games, even though I still like in my brain, I still like crunchy games. But lately we've been having a lot of fun with kind of the more rules light
I
games and
like
stuff like that.
games where I don't have to check the rules all the time. And Shadowrun is one of those games where you're probably going to have to crack the book at least once or
Frequently.
twice during a session. Yeah. Because something is going to happen where you're like, I know there's a rule for that and I should probably go look. And
Mhm.
I prefer games that are like medium crunched where I can kind of remember it. That's kind of what I look
Yeah,
forward to.
that's fair. Yeah, it's good. That's a good point. Jeff, do you think that the Shadowrun is the game you would recommend to other people?
I would recommend people if they want something in that kind of setting that's a little bit
Hmm.
lighter and much more narrative.
Yeah,
I think it's definitely worth a shot because
and
you do get a lot of the flavor. I felt some of the flavor, and maybe it's because we'd all played a little bit of Shadowrun, not. But I would definitely recommend
yeah,
Shadowrun Anarchy.
Hmm.
fair enough. Yeah, I think if you're looking for a gateway drug into getting into Shadowrun and deciding if you want to do all of the rules at some point, Shadowrun Anarchy is a great place to start. You know, even if you do the rules light version with less narrative
I would suggest it's a
distribution,
great place to stay. Like you should just pick up Shadowrun Anarchy, run a Shadowrun game that way, and
just stay there.
avoid the regular
Hey man,
rules
if you love the crunch, just go
until
for it.
they come out with a new version. That's hopefully that seventh edition fixes some of the weird stuff that happened in sixth edition. So
I'm curious if Shadowrun Anarchy is ever going to get a second edition. I mean, it came out many, many years ago, many moons at this point. Um, so I'm sure that there's enough things that people have complained about that they could probably improve upon in this. Um,
they seem
if
dead
they
set on their cool rule set though. Like they've put out a lot of corrections for it in the
for
last few
Shadowrun
years.
Anarchy or the
No, the sixth
Sixth edition.
edition.
oh no,
Like
yeah, they
yeah, they. What I'm saying is they're dead set on selling that system. I think that system, not necessarily Anarchy.
oh that's fair. Yeah. Well, Dude,
Say la vie.
yeah. But right now, if you go to Drive Through RPG, you can get Shadowrun Anarchy, the PDF, and all 218 pages of glory for less than $15. So, not even that expensive to start your shadow runs in the sixth world, one could say. So, okay. Well then, great talk. I think that was a lot of. I think that was a good game to play. It was a lot of fun for you guys. We played it off
Yeah.
stream, so sorry we don't have a actual play that you guys can watch us do any of the wacky, crazy shit that happened. But
We might have a stream at some point about Shadowrun, though.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe.
we may.
I love the
revisit
game,
it.
so I love the game, so it's one of those ones that I like to pick up once in a while.
Sounds good. So if you want to leave us comments, if you like, us talking about games or whatever topics you want, suggest things in the comments. Say hi. Tell us we missed a very invalid point in the comments. Whatever you want to do. If you made it this far, we appreciate you nonetheless. So like, subscribe, share, do what you want to do. We'd like to hear from you. So Brent, how else, or I guess Jeff, how else do they talk to us if they want to maybe go in other avenues of social media?
They would search for @Rollwise on most platforms. So Facebook, Threads, Twitter, Blue Sky.
Yep.
Yay! Not TikTok, unfortunately. And you can also email us rollwiseguys@gmail.com.
Ooh, topical on the TikTok. And as always, thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate you joining our table, going on us with this journey, and as always, roll well, roll wise, and be safe out there, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah.